Hey, yo, Rod.
Hey, yo, Eric.
So glad to have you on the second mini episode. We're going to dive right into MMA head first. But before we do, just wanted to get a little preview, I suppose, of the next A Few Words podcast, because someone that you and I know very well, the audience might not know well. We've mentioned him a few times in previous episodes, but your childhood friend, Brian Coppola, will be my guest. We've been friends a long time, and you were his best man when he got married almost 2 years ago, believe it or not. So let us know what we can expect from this one-on-one.
I definitely have known Brian since '92, and it was one of those things where we became best friends pretty much instantly. Like, we hung out, and after that, every day we just hung out, and I probably wouldn't have the vision or the production background or even the idea that I wanted to be in production if it wasn't for him. We kind of started like making movies together and everything else. He was really like my right-hand man for a lot of the films that we made when we were younger. So yeah, I think the fans are going to expect some interesting talk, some good convo, and some good insight from him.
You've described the dynamic between you and he in the past as similar to the dynamic between Lawrence and myself, where we were very tight collaborators on a lot of the projects that we worked on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We would do a lot of brainstorming together, even for my own films. Like, I would run stuff by with him, and he would definitely, like, keep me in check or, like, kind of enhance the idea, or if he thought that, like, we could do something better. I was always acceptable to his ideas. If I was dealing with one actor, he will deal with the other people. Great co-director, very great co-director. He did all the camera work for the It Girl, so it really helped having him there.
And the It Girl was a movie that you had made that you submitted to festivals. And Brian and I, you mentioned collaboration. He was someone that I consulted with when starting this podcast. We had talked about doing an audio show or podcast many times over the years, and that's why I thanked him in the first episode. So he's now the 10th. The first guest through Skype, and that's what we're doing this mini podcast on right now. So let's get right into it. I was in Vegas.
Mini about this podcast, Eric.
That's right, especially with the biggest show on paper supposedly ever. And I was in Vegas for UFC 200. I did a blog while I was out there. I think it was a nice companion piece in many ways to the first UFC blog that I did, which was number 4 for UFC 100 back in 2009. And now here in 2016, 10 video blogs later, we're doing UFC 200. And I gave my thoughts on a lot of the fights then, so I'd like to hear some of yours. I know you saw the last 2 fights in particular. So I had already given my thoughts on most of the card at this point, but I just wanted to make one more and consolidate really the Daniel Cormier Anderson Silva fight along with the Brock Lesnar Mark Hunt fight, because in my mind anyway, UFC 200, I said on the blog, may not have lived up to the hype as 100 did, and I could see that in a way because 100 had the great moments of the Dan Henderson knockout on Michael Bisping, one of the best ever, and we're going to get the rematch in England hopefully soon later this year, so that's cool. And of course, Brock smashing Frank Mir in the main event. George St. Pierre, round after round, taking Thiago Alves down at will. So there were a lot of great moments, and I thought it would be very poetic that John Jones in the prelims for UFC 100 would headline 200, but that was not to be. As it was, Daniel Cormier ended up fighting Anderson Silva, who, especially after this performance, granted it was on a day's notice, but like I said on the blog, I feel like this fight would have gone the same way, training, prepared or not. Anderson Silva just hasn't been the same since he lost the championship. And for Daniel Cormier and Brock, there really wasn't any other way for them to win this fight. They had to take these strikers down. I understand people boo. I don't really get people disliking Daniel Cormier, especially in this whole situation. I thought how he is the heel, the villain, I don't get it. But if you're going to boo Daniel Cormier for not finishing Anderson Silva and winning a boring style, fine. But what about the guys on the bottom? It's their job to get up from that. If someone's laying on top of you and you know from grappling and doing your training, it's your job to get out from underneath that. You can't just let someone lay on top of you. As difficult as that might be when you're fighting gravity and hundreds of pounds on top of you, you still have to get out. And that's what Joanna Jędrzejczyk did, which I thought was the fight of the weekend, frankly, the main event of Ultimate Fighter finale against Claudia Gadelha, which was a great fight. And that's exactly what she did. She got taken down for 2 rounds, and then the last 3, she struck the hell out of her, and everyone loved that. So what do you think about the style, especially with your wrestling background that we talked about on the podcast, that Brock and Cormier utilized in those 2 fights?
Well, I think it's very different because what people have to understand is that, first of all, when she was getting taken down, she did very little to stop a lot of the takedowns in the first 2 rounds. And then, yes, like when Claudia started getting a little bit more tired, even exhausted as Claudia was, she was still able to land 1 or 2 takedowns. And Joanna did a good job of getting back up. But the difference is Joanna trained to fight Claudia. Silva didn't do any training, took this fight on 2 days' notice. And when you have an Olympic caliber wrestler on top of you in pinning position, it's a whole different level. And someone who is much bigger, someone who has won and is undefeated at heavyweight, fighting a middleweight. So I think that would be very tough to overcome. And for Cormier, you know, he's not going to sit there and risk standing up with Anderson Silva. He didn't have to take this fight. He fought to make money, to still be on the card, and, you know, to kind of give the fans who came to see him the chance to see him fight. It kind of sucks because when you look at it on paper, like, holy shit, Daniel Cormier versus Anderson Silva, it should have been a lot bigger.
Not even that one, but just the fact, like the day before, I was saying, I'm about to see Brock Lesnar, Anderson Silva, and Miesha Tate all on the same card tomorrow. That's insane. On paper, it was a great card.
Unbelievable. And as far as hype goes, to make comparisons to UFC 100 and UFC 200, no one has mentioned that the main event for UFC 100 was originally supposed to be the main event of UFC 98.
Right.
It wasn't like they had these huge plans. I mean, going up for UFC 200, some people had these ridiculous fucking cards as if it was going to be the last UFC event ever. Like, it was like Cyborg and Rousey and McGregor and Frankie, GSP and Anderson Silva, and fucking, I don't know, Brock Lesnar coming back. And, like, really, bro? Like, you gotta be realistic. Like, yes, it's a big event, but I thought they put on a lot more than they needed to. Yeah, it was great, but fans still weren't happy with the card itself before. It was pretty ridiculous considering who was on the undercard. As far as Brock goes and, like, his style, I think people kind of expected that. You know, that's his style. It's people kind of give heavyweights a little bit more leeway. Brock isn't exactly a stand-up fighter, so he already said this is a grappler versus striker match, and this is what it was built as. And Brock went out there, got the perfect game plan, and really looked very good, really good.
Brock has been a headliner recently in the news because of his drug test failure. USADA popped him for, what was it? I know they tested him a whole handful of times, but it was
estrogen blockers.
Yes, for the pre-fight and the post-fight. That was something you were really railing against in text to me, that you're really sick of this USADA shit. So in light of what happened with John Jones and this Chad Mendes just getting suspended recently for 2 years, explain to me why you think, I'm guessing, gauging from your text, that everyone should just be allowed to do whatever drugs they want.
Because they're ruining my life, Eric. They're ruining my life. Maybe it's me. I'm the guy who likes to see everyone hit home runs instead of line drives to second base. You know, I'm the guy who likes to see these guys make the card, put on great fights, and, you know, just be athletic specimens out there. People have to understand what a physically demanding sport MMA is, and you're doing it for nothing, and you're training harder, if not as hard, as pro athletes in other sports.
But that excuses cheating and using drugs.
Is it cheating if you don't know you're cheating?
So is this the tainted substance excuse? I didn't know what was in it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, like, when you're on that level, when you're getting paid to fight, and you know that there's like an Olympic level drug testing policy, I think that you should be very careful and look at everything in the label. I mean, I've heard Chael Sonnen talk about, him trying to send over supplements to USADA, and they won't tell him if it's okay or not. Are you trying to fail people? Like, what's going on? I think USADA could do a better job in educating fighters, because it feels like a lot of these fighters are getting popped and it's catching them off guard. And instead of like fighting it and going to court and possibly losing out on more money, they just, eat it and accept it.
Coming full circle again with Brock, after 100, which I was also out in Vegas for, of course, I remember calling home and my dad saying that he had heard, he wasn't a fight fan or anything. He'd watch it here and there if I was watching it. But I remember him saying, this Brock guy, I hear he's going to fight a Russian. And even before Brock got in the cage this time again, it's funny how he left wrestling and MMA and came back to both in that order. But again, this time with Fedor fighting on Fight Pass recently in Russia against Fabio Maldonado, which was horrid, people were talking about Fedor in the conversation. Could Fedor and Brock fight at MSG? Obviously, Brock's future is very much in doubt now, up in the air. But even so, I think if a deal would have been able to be reached, and it's funny that that fight originally was set, they wanted to do it in Cowboy Stadium. And what did we end up when Brock ended up finally performing there? Dean Ambrose. But
oh, at least he won.
Yeah, right. But I think if Fedor got in the ring with Brock today, he would get destroyed. It wouldn't even be a contest. I'd still love to see it, of course, in a freak show Bellator type way, because it is Fedor finally stepping foot in the UFC. But that's going to lead to a question from one of our listeners, John White, who asked us, how do you think Fedor, if he was in his prime, like, let's say Pride version Fedor, how would he do in the UFC today with the division that